Knock, knock, guys. It's Mrs. Klein.
What's new? It's Mrs. Wilbren.
All right, we're back, you guys, with another podcast for Lesson 12, Foreign Affairs in the Young Nation. Just as a reminder, we've got the guiding question: to what extent should the United States have become involved in world affairs in the early 1800s? Okay. Last podcast, we wrapped up with the War of 1812 and kind of the aftermath of that. And now we're going to move on to what happens beyond that.
Exactly. And we're going to be talking about sections 8 and 9. And the first section we're going to talk about is President Monroe's dilemma. So President Monroe serves after Madison, and we have a new foreign policy challenge during his presidency. James Monroe became president in 1817. After the excitement of the War of 1812, he was relieved to return the nation to its policy of isolationism. Americans began to turn their attention away from Europe, however, and direct it towards events happening in Latin America. From Mexico to the tip of South America, Latin Americans were raising up in revolt against Spain.
All right. So as Mrs. Wilburn mentioned, there were a couple of revolutions that were happening in Latin America. In Mexico, the revolt against Spanish rule was inspired by a Catholic priest named Miguel Hidalgo. Hidalgo gave a speech that's remembered today as the Cry of Dolores, which inspired a revolution that lasted 10 years. In 1821, Mexico finally won its independence from Spain.
Two other leaders liberated South America. In 1810, a Venezuelan named Simón Bolívar launched a revolution in the north with this cry: "Spaniards, you will receive death at our hands. Americans, you will receive life." Jose de San Martin, my Spanish is not good, sorry, a revolutionary from Argentina, led the struggle for independence in the South. By the end of 1826, the last Spanish troops had been driven out of South America.
All right. So many Americans, you guys, were excited by independence movements in Latin America. However, European leaders were not so pleased. President James Monroe asked former presidents Thomas Jefferson and James Madison for advice. He's trying to figure out, what should the United States do? Should the United States do something to support the new Latin American nations? If so, what?
Okay. Jefferson wrote to James Monroe: "Our first and fundamental principle should be never entangle ourselves in the fights of Europe. Our second, never to suffer Europe to interfere with America, North and South." President Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who is the son of John Adams, agreed with Jefferson. But Adams insisted that it would be more candid or honest, as well as more dignified, for the United States to speak boldly for itself. President Monroe agreed.
Okay, and in 1823, Monroe announced in his annual message to Congress a policy that became known as the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe stated that the nations of North and South America were free and independent and were not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. The United States, he said, would view efforts by Europeans to take over any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. Yes. So not just what was going down there, but if you guys are going to come back into our hemisphere, we're going to take it, we're going to have to do something about it, basically.
Exactly.
Okay, all right.
In the years ahead, the Monroe Doctrine joined isolationism as a basic principle of U.S. foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine told the world that the United States was no longer a weak collection of quarreling states. It was becoming a strong and confident nation, a nation to be respected by the world.
Okay, guys, so let's just reiterate a little bit about the issue, the problem that President Monroe had. So he, in support of the new Latin American states, he issued a policy that was called the Monroe Doctrine, which warned European nations to respect the independence of Spain's former colonies. The Monroe Doctrine established the United States as a strong nation willing to stand up for its own freedom and that of its neighbors.
Yeah. And with that, bon voyage.
All right. TTYL, guys.